Okay, great. Thanks. Firstly, let me just apologize. I had the time 30 minutes late, so I thought I was being very good by joining 15 minutes early. So sorry about that. Um, so I want to raise this question. The main challenge that we face right now is the fact that we are in an environment where we are being restricted in terms of how we can articulate what we are feeling and the moment of history that we find ourselves in, even in countries like the United States, where one thought you could take freedom of speech for granted. So the challenge today is how do we speak truth to power on the one hand and avoid sanitizing the fact that humanity is in a deep, deep crisis? How do we do it in a way that informs, inspires, and energizes, not demotivate, immobilize, and create despair? I'll share with you an anecdote. Speaking to a group in the United States some years ago, at the end of my speech, somebody put up their hand and said, Kumi, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And I said, yes, I heard of him, and he inspired me and many other people in our struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And then she asked me, what was his most famous speech? Thinking it was a trick question, I answered it very hesitantly. I said, I have a dream. And she shouted back, yes, it's I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a bloody nightmare. So the challenge then for us is finding that sweet spot between not sanitizing the fact that we are in a deep crisis, the economic system is failing, the energy system is failing, and so on. But how do we do it in a way that keeps people believing that their actions can inspire positive change? I want to do a quick quiz right now and pose this question to you and ask one of the facilitators to help me just take the temperature in the room. Where are we as humanity in addressing the pressing issue of climate change? I'm going to give you three options. Option one, no reason to panic. Our government and business leaders will get their acts together and will somehow prevent the worst of climate catastrophe, recognizing that we are already in mini catastrophes already. Option two, we recognize the challenge is massive, but sorry, a mic has gone on and I'm getting the echo back again. Sorry about that. But the window of opportunity to turn things around is still there, but it's fast closing. But with human creativity, ingenuity, and application, we can broaden out that window and reverse the path we're on. And option three, if I might be permitted to use a sentence from the Dutch derived language in South Africa called Afrikaans, which I don't think will require any interpretation. Option three can be stated as ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. Okay, I hope that translated. So, things are too late. So if I could just quickly ask you to put up your hands if you think we're in option one.
Kumi, I have to come off the microphone so you can hear me say, no one has put up their hands at all. Actually, it's quite awkward here. No one has put up their hand.
Okay, that's today the normal response most people give. Option two?
Look, I'm bad at maths, but I want to say 70% of the room, maybe even 80.
And option three?
One lone person, Simon Batterbury. Thank you for being brave. Sorry, maybe one person behind me as well. Kumi, just so you know, we're trying to get you on the screen, but if you wouldn't mind stop sharing your screen so we could see you, that would actually be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, so if I'm brutally honest with you, there are days when I wake up where it's option two, and the days where I wake up, it's option 2.5, and so on. So we cannot sanitize the fact that actually humanity is facing a serious challenge. So the most crucial message I want to leave you with is pessimism in the moment of history that we find ourselves in is a luxury we simply cannot afford. However, the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. We need to be asking ourselves some difficult questions. Why is it that we have been negotiating around climate since 1992, when the first COP was held effectively? Why is it that today we still see the problem moving in the wrong direction? And the answer to that is that, if I can tell you through an anecdote, in 2009, when we were in Copenhagen, we were demanding a FAB deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. But instead, what we got was a FLAB deal, FLAB, full of loopholes and bullshit. And so what we have seen is that because the COP isn't binding, governments can just walk away from it. Imagine, even though fossil fuels constitutes 86% of the cause of climate change, it took us 28 years before, in the climate negotiations, we can mention even the words fossil fuels. That's like Alcoholics Anonymous holding 28 years of conferences before they have the courage to mention the word alcohol. It's absurd. And it's because of the power of the fossil fuel lobby. Therefore, a new initiative has emerged to develop a binding treaty that it tries to achieve three things. One, governments who participate in this process, which we hope to launch next year, will say, knowing what we know and the threat that fossil fuels poses, we will not invest new monies into fossil fuels. The second is to say that we'll plan the fastest possible phase out. And the third is to say we will do it in a fair, just way that does not punishes either workers in the fossil fuel industry or the communities around fossil fuel infrastructure that depend upon it. Now, people like myself have sweated blood, sweat and tears, as I'm sure Lynn and others in your community have done as well. So we are very committed to hanging on to some of the things that we fought really hard to achieve in the 2015 Paris climate negotiations. However, Paris is inadequate on its own, and that is why we need a treaty which is more binding. So the 5 phases of building up the treaty is first building the movement, which has been going very well, by getting political buy-in. And I'm pleased to say that we have many countries in your part of the world, in the Pacific, that have joined, as well as 2 fossil fuel exporting countries and so on, to kickstart the process. And now we are focused on the third step, which is formalizing the multilateral process. And then the negotiations hopefully start next year. And then after that, it's a question of holding countries accountable to what they commit to. Now, you might think, in this current context, how difficult it is to negotiate a treaty to the UN system, and you'd be right. So, however, there are cases where a cluster of forward-looking countries came together, agreed a treaty, and then brought it within the UN system. The Montreal Protocol around the ozone layer, we had a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, and the one that we are tracking and trying to follow most closely, I would say, is the landmine ban treaty, where 44 countries negotiated outside of the UN system and then brought it within the UN system and got buy-in. Now, today, when we look at who is supporting this idea, just to give you a sense that it's become quite broad-based, we have 4,000 civil society organizations that includes trade unions, NGOs, faith institutions, and so on. We have 10 indigenous nations that have joined, and then we have 118 cities and states. So, for example, the Australian Capital Territory has joined, the city of Newcastle, Sydney in Australia has joined, and so on. And then we have 1 million individuals, 800 parliamentarians, 3,000 plus scientists, academics, and researchers, 25 banks from the Alliance of a global alliance for banking on values, and 600 plus faith institutions. So the first nations that have moved have been the Pacific Island nations, and we thank especially Tuvalu and Vanuatu for their leadership. And as you know, Australia is bidding to co-host COP31 with Pacific nations. And so what does true solidarity with the Pacific look like? And I would argue that the actions of the Australian government already in the last week would suggest that Australia is actually undermining its ability to legitimately host the climate negotiations. So Pacific nations have been clear. Solidarity means action, not rhetoric. Now, I just want to say one thing about Australia, that the Australian government can show that they are meeting their Paris climate obligations around reducing emissions within the US. But some of you might be shocked to know that the worst, highest exporter of fossil fuels is Russia, the second is Saudi Arabia, and the third is Australia. And so Australia cannot have it both ways. They cannot say, oh, domestically we will take care of, ensuring that we reduce our emissions, but they then export it elsewhere and build their whole economy and their revenue on that basis. So what do we need to do? We need to turbocharge intersectionality. We need to stop pretending that actually climate change is an environmental issue. Climate change is a cross-cutting issue. It's an issue about our economy, our energy system, our transport system, our food system, and so on. And we have to address climate change in a much more people-centric way. We also need to recognize that we've made a big mistake over time, and that is we have focused all our communications to the brain, with science and policies and acronyms, 350 parts per million, 1.5 degrees, and so on, and we've ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. We have to start talking about climate change in a way that our members of our family can understand. This graphic up on your stage, on your screen, is from 2011 when I was going to occupy an oil rig in Greenland where a UK company was starting to drill, and thankfully by the time they found any oil, they had to give up and they left. But while I was on the inflatable boat going to the rig from the Greenpeace ship called the Arctic Sunrise, what you can't really see too much in that image, but the seas were very rough. And my colleague, seeing that I was nervous, said to me, "Oh, Kumi, don't worry, if you fall into the ocean, you'll survive at least 2 hours with what you are wearing, because with normal swimming gear, you'll be dead in about 3 to 5 minutes from hypothermia." And I looked at the size of the waves and I thought, oh my God, it might take them 2 hours to find me. And I had this horrible feeling, this was 2011, that if that was the last thing I did, most of my friends, family, and colleagues back home in Africa wouldn't know what that banner I was holding. Because at that time, people didn't realize that the Arctic serves as a refrigerator and air conditioner of the planet. And because, for example, in the summer months, we have sea ice being so less, it actually, impacts in quite a negative way. So the other thing we need to do is stop denying the reality of how close to the cliff we are. We are seeing massive climate impacts in virtually every country around the world, and we need to stop denying reality and respond to what we are seeing with the courage that the situation calls for. The other thing we need to do is embrace a culture of emergence. That is, we need to recognize that it doesn't matter, and actually none of us are sitting with all the answers. We know that the broad direction of travel that we want to go is to go in the direction of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing gender equality, decentralizing energy systems, and so on. While we know that that's the direction of travel, we might not know all the details of exactly how much of solar, how much of wind, how much of heat pumps, and so on. These things will have to be negotiated. And if you think about it, if you are a leader in the climate justice movements, right? If you stand before people and say, I know everything and all we need to do is ABC, so just join and do what I tell you to do. It's a less attractive proposition to invite people into our movements than if we say to them, listen, we know that's the direction we have to travel. Please join us and help us figure out the detail of how we're going to get there. That, I would argue, is a much more persuasive way of mobilizing people. The other mistake we must not continue to make is to mistake access for influence. So very often people who are doing this work have to meet with ministers, heads of state, UN officials, local governments, and so on. And many of us have historically taken this very seriously. And what we thought was when we had those meetings, we had influence, but actually, mainly we had access. If I reflect on all the meetings I've had with heads of state, ministers, and so on, most of the time when I went into those meetings, I knew what they were going to say. They knew what I was going to say. I knew where we're going to land as an outcome, and they knew likewise. So we were going through a ritual where they ticked off a box saying civil society consulted, and we ticked off a box saying government lobbied against. So I'm not saying that we should never engage with government, but we need to make sure that when we do engage, governments take us more seriously when they know that we have a army of people behind us, when they know that we have a real constituency of people that support what we are saying. So uh, uh, Fridays for the Future calls this handshake activism. So basically, we need to get the proportionality right. We should not give our legitimacy to governments who are wanting photo ops to show that they're doing the right thing when in fact they are dragging their feet and ignoring the science. So very importantly, we have to find multiple ways in which people can participate, right? We need to, I organize this into four quadrants: harnessing our autonomy, harnessing our creative participation, harnessing our wealth, and harnessing our consumption. And you read each of the things from the center where we remind ourselves that notwithstanding the oppression, the colonialism, slavery, and neoliberal economic system and so on that people have suffered under, people still have agency. And today, we need this level and scale of participation to be the biggest humanity has ever seen so that we can push those in power to act faster than they would otherwise do. But there's also another reason. We are dealing with a global mental health crisis as a result of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety and the rise of fascism. And participation itself is going to be an antidote to despair. It helps people build communities. It helps us develop networks of support and so on. So participation is something that we need in creative ways, in alternative ways. Each of us should contribute in the ways where we have skills and inclinations to behave in a particular way, not to go do something that we're not really good at and so on. And there's enough to do that we can find that match between people's interests and what movements need them to do. Most importantly, I would say that if we're going to break through the communications deficit that we face, we have to embrace the idea of artivism. And what I would say is that mobilizing the full power of arts and culture on its own will not deliver us salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crises. However, failure to harness the power of arts and culture almost guarantees that we will fail. So, with the support of folks from the Pacific, last year, the Global Artivism Movement was launched in an inaugural conference with 89 countries, 750 people, and so on in South Africa. The second one takes place just before the climate negotiations in Brazil, in Salvador Bahia, from the 2nd to the 4th of November. And if Australia gets the next COP, then we will do it in Fiji just before the COP, as the third one, where we're building a movement of arts and cultural creatives who are bringing their voice to help us communicate in more accessible ways, in more creative ways, also to communicate to people who do not have necessarily high levels of university education and literacy and so on. In the Pacific, there's a group called This Is Our Home. They're based out of New Zealand, but they're from all over the Pacific, from Samoa and so on. And This is them performing with Coldplay, and they have brought the climate message in a way that really, really moves people into understanding the urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in. So just remind ourselves that culture is power. Culture shapes our imagination and how we view the world. Art, culture, and stories change people, and people change systems. Therefore, great influence is wielded by those who have cultural power and cultural infrastructure. Cultural and narrative strategies are fundamental in our path towards justice, liberation, and equality. Cultural change precedes political change. Culture can show us the future that has not yet arrived. Culture can help us, and arts in particular, can help us imagine worlds that are yet to be born. We must invest in culture to build lasting narrative power and move hearts and minds. This is from a prominent artist called Fabiana Rodriguez, who is one of the leaders of the global energizing activism movement. So I want to conclude by saying that the struggle for justice is a marathon and not a sprint. And if you are anything like me, there are going to be many days when you wake up and you read the news and you're going to feel a bit despondent. But you've got to tell yourself that there are certain people in power, corporate power and business and governmental power, who want us to feel that our voice, our participation, our contributions are meaningless. But let's be very clear, and I want to end on a positive note. On the one hand, some of the challenges that we are seeing in the world right now, even with democracy, is much bigger than I can remember in 45 years of activism. So I don't want to sugarcoat the moment we are in. The moment is quite challenging. But on the positive side, I cannot remember any moment in history over the last 45 years that I've been in the front lines of various struggles where the appetite for big structural and systemic change is as high as it is right now. So I end with saying to you, this moment does not call for the rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks. This moment calls for innovation, for creativity, for participation, and so on. And it also calls for young people's leadership. So to the young people in the audience, I say to you, do not accept it when people in my generation say young people are the leaders of tomorrow, because you will wait for tomorrow, there won't be a tomorrow for you to exercise leadership. Take leadership now. Bring the freshness of your perspective on old, intractable challenges that my generation has not solved, and let's build a world of greater equity, greater justice, greater sustainability, and greater harmony. Thank you very much, and good luck with your conference.